Okay. I think we're live now. So yeah, I wanted to welcome everyone to this launch event for the Landed series. That it's just the first episode was released on Farmerama on Sunday, and we will be releasing the next 3 episodes every fortnight. So look out for those, and hopefully anyone who did tune in really enjoyed the first episode, kind of getting acquainted with Col's home or new home and returning to the farm and the whole journey that is about. I could hear a funny noise in the background, but hopefully it's okay. I don't think it's my computer. And we've just lost one of the people short, hopefully temporarily. But anyway, welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. And we're going to start out by just introducing everyone who's here. So I'll start by saying I'm Abby Rose. I'm one of the co-creators of Farmerama Radio, and we're about sharing the voices of the regenerative farming movement and community. And it's been a real honor to work with Col Gordon on this series. He approached us, I don't know, maybe 9 months ago, saying he was going to be doing this research about what does it mean to return to the family farm and the many complicated questions that actually brings up, and some very deep thinking he'd been doing about, or he wanted to do about that. And so we've been part of the journey, and that's been a real pleasure. And then today we're bringing together voices from all over the world, actually, who are also thinking in different ways about this same idea of what does it mean to be in relationship with land and on land and connected to land, and even to own land. All of those questions that we're raising today. So I wanted to invite everyone to introduce a little bit about what they're working on. And I was going to start with Erin Matariki Carr, who is in, I can never say this correctly, but New Zealand, Aotearoa. Oh, sorry. Hope I got that right. And Erin has been, like, actually, for me this year, one of the most exciting and inspiring people I've come across. Like, what you're doing at River is absolutely amazing, because you're sharing about what it means, or your Indigenous roots and all of that work and all that means to you, whilst also providing such a welcoming space to those who, you know, don't identify as Indigenous, and inviting us to understand and share in your worldview. And I really, really appreciate that. So yeah, please do tell us more about River.
Oh, well, kia ora tātou, morena tātou. Thank you, Abby, for that beautiful introduction. Yes, my name's Erin Matariki, and I'm here at Aotearoa. We can practice that one later. Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I just want to take a moment to say kia ora to Col and Josina, tēnā koe, and Severine, tēnā kōrua. It's a real honour to be sitting on this board on this panel, this virtual panel with you all, and to share in such important conversation for us right now. So kia ora mai tātou. So I belong to I belong to Ngāi Tūhoi, Ngāti Awa, and I also, those are my iwi, or my tribes here in Aotearoa. And I am also of English descent, Welsh and Croatian through my whakapapa, through the settlers that came here. So I honour that whakapapa, or that genealogy as well. And I'm living in the North Island in a place called Taneatua, close by Te Uruwera rainforest. And Tiuruwira was the first place in the world that was granted legal personhood. So I can talk a little bit about that later too. But just in answer to your question, I'm part of a wonderful group called Revell, which stands for Revitalizing Indigenous Values for Earth's Regeneration. It's a really clever acronym. Lots of metaphors come off river and very fun. So I co-lead Revell with a very good friend of mine, Jody Gustafsson, who's just recently got out of quarantine in the Yukon. She's gone back home to where she grew up in Canada. And she is Indigenous from Labrador in Canada. So Jody and I met a couple of years ago, and we've been working with a collective with some wonderful people from Turtle Island here in Aotearoa and Australia. And as you said, Abby, a lot of our mahi a lot of our work is about uplifting Indigenous value systems, recognising Indigenous legal systems and worldviews, and also shining a light on the worldview of the West, which dominates all of us and which can be so normalised in our world that we don't see it. And I think there's a lot of power in illuminating the Western worldview so that we can actually see that we've got these biases. And things like you mentioned ownership earlier is one of those core normals that we just accept as part of our reality that actually should be challenged a little bit more and explored. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I see it as one that's going to stretch our imaginations for what's possible in our world. So thank you. Ngā mihi nunui kia koutou. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. Okay, Aotearoa. I've written it down so I can see it and read it, and I will practice because it's a beautiful word. So thank you so much, Erin. And next I was going to invite Severine Fleming to speak. Severine is now farming in Maine. I visited the farm. It's a wonderful place full of blueberries and oysters and all different types of farming you can imagine, right there on the sea front. So yeah, I think you're there right now, enjoying the Maine summer. But yeah, Severine, maybe you could share a little bit about the Agrarian Trust, which I know you were part of the founding of, and now I think a board member on the Agrarian Trust. And a little bit about everything you do, I guess.
Gladly. So yeah, we're in the middle of a heat wave and it's very hot and there's like 5 panting animals in the house with me. We farm on the sea, and last year the sea took about 5 feet of the land that is ours away into the sea. And so it's a nice reminder of the great metabolism of our animate earth, who digests all into continuing cycles and currents. And the flows of energies that predate us, outlast us, and that make conceptions of private property that we may hold dear in our legal systems, in our cultural systems, absolutely and utterly obsolete in geologic time. And so, but we try not to be, this time of year, we can be philosophical about a lot of things. My world has been in organic agriculture for 15 years as an organizer within Greenhorns, which is a national young farmers cultural organization that publishes a New Farmers Almanac. That's a place for thinking together about the issues we face as young agrarians. And as a person who's interested in like welcoming the people who are coming into agriculture, like fully in the sense of our mutual kinship with one another and the larger project, and of course, you know, an earth in crisis. And as part of that project, we of course had to confront how challenging it is in late stage capitalism for a young person to get their hands on some land. And the circle that grew around that problem became the kind of like orbiting committee from which grew Agrarian Trust as a set of principles and best practices that we wanted to enact in the real world as a kind of like direct action performance of land reform for the sake of our larger community, which is about 100,000, you know, people involved in ag in some way. And then actually to do it, to actually take land out of private property context and have it held in a commons. And so Agrarian Trust is that. It's a national land trust, community land trust, based on a lot of the work done by our elders in the kind of new economy movement. And we have most recently in Maine brought land into the trust on behalf of the Somali Bantu Association. It's called Little Juba Commons, and it's a beautiful land that's being farmed by some 70 farmers who are part of a refugee diasporic community who have resettled in the United States from Somalia, and who are continuing their own legacy of land stewardship here in a new land. And so the way that it works is that the land comes into the trust, and then it's held and governed according to the principles of Eleanor Ostrom, with these governing boards, which are made up of members from the community, members who are farmers, and members who represent and are kind of like voices of the watershed, the local farm community, and the kind of local small business community, so that we have like representative holding. And I could go on and on, but I think I should stay short. Just to say it's happening, and the one in Maine that just happened, the one in West Virginia that's happening, the one in Wisconsin, the one in Montana, the one that's now in British Columbia, each of them really represents the farm organism, like of the social kind of crystal pattern of relation that forms and builds energy around a working farm. And then that kind of crystal pattern of relationship is also what has to hold it over time. And so it's a lot of humans involved.
Perfect. That definitely ties into some of the themes in Landed, I have to say. Okay, I'm gonna now invite Josina to share a little bit about Lion. Josina is actually featured in the series as well, and has been an ongoing co-creator of the series alongside Col and Katie Revell. And it's been, well, I haven't been as involved as the three of them, but from afar and what I have done, it's been a real nourishing experience and a joy to be part of with Josina as well. So thank you, Josina, and please do share a little bit about what you're up to and a bit about Lion.
Greetings, good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be here this evening, and it's been a delight to work on the series as well. I've learned so much, and it's really tied in well with our work on articulating a vision for reparative justice in this country. And as I said in our sort of closing retrospective meeting recently, like, we don't know what the ripples yet will be, but it feels big, because these are new issues that are being tackled, even though they're also very old issues from a very old time. I'm part of a collective. I'm co-founder of a collective called Land in Our Names, or Lion, and we are a land justice and racial justice collective made up of people who are interested in food growing and nature connection and changing the relationship of people to land in Britain in particular, inspired by people who are fighting land justice struggles across the globe. And we are Black-led for Black people and people of colour. And at the moment, our work is looking at the barriers for food growers, barriers for people who want to be farming, and the impacts of rural racism and, you know, historic dispossession of people from land in countries where we have heritage as well as here. And it was great to be able to visit Col and Sarah in Scotland as part of this, and to sort of really see what the landscape, how it can be so alive, and hear from people who are, keeping traditions alive, and that could be, part of our stories as well. I have Scottish heritage on both sides. One side is, well, both sides were colonizing and exploring pleasantly across the globe. The work is reconciling the good and the bad, the things to be proud of and the things that we need to be honest of, picking off the scabs. And that's not a great way to describe this, the podcast, but I do think that it does do a great job of picking off the scabs and celebrating the good.
Perfect. Thanks, Josina. Picking off the scabs. There is always a curiosity around that. So in a way, maybe it is a good metaphor to really get people curious and digging in to some of these topics. And that's perfectly led us into Col. Obviously, I've already said Col is the reason we even started on this journey. And you've been doing a great deal of research for the last 9-12 months, maybe longer, I don't know. But we wanted, maybe you could share a little bit about the extent of that research and why did you want to make this series, and also a little bit about what you do.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you, Abby. And I'll start by just saying what an honor and a humbling privilege it is to be able to share a screen with everyone here. It's really inspiring and humbling. So I'm Col. I'm from a family farm in the north of Scotland in the Highlands. We have been a farming family for a good number of generations, and we are landowners. We own the farm, and I've wanted to farm this piece of land most of my life, but it's become apparent just over time thinking about it, just that the structure of a family farm is, even within a family, it can be quite problematic, because I'm the oldest of 3 brothers, and just this ongoing conversation, which is quite a difficult conversation anyway, about what happens to the land once succession happens. And that has been something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, is just like, can we work out models that are able to have more than one quote unquote owner of a piece of land? And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and also just thinking, pulling this out a little bit further, it's just what's going to happen to all of this land when this current generation of farmers starts retiring from the land. And I was getting increasingly concerned, because I've been saying for a long time, farmers are getting older. What's going to happen, and where's this conversation? And it doesn't seem like it's a live conversation as what's going to happen when people start to retire. So as I say, I've been thinking about this for a number of years, just that question. And it was only when I finally managed to return to the farm that I read this line on a social media feed that really just knocked me back for 6, which was the family farm, or the small family farm, is a colonial concept. And I for me, that this was really, really powerful moment, because I hadn't thought about this question through that lens ever before, despite maybe 10 years this question. And that question has been sort of the basis of this series and my investigations into it, and sort of with the series I've decided to stick to one specific part of the world, which is where I'm from, where I live, and that's the Scottish Highlands, and look at how that question plays out there. not because I think it's anything special. It's just this is the story of this one place. But I think that story has got relevance to all sorts of places across the world, both in terms of similarities between what happened and what the land relations were like before we potentially were colonized. The land was colonized. And what was there before? What were the land relations, and then also the implications of the people who had to leave, and then they left, and what they did to the places they went to, and where the family farm as a structure and as a model sits within all this, because it becomes quite a tangled mess, really. And I've just been utterly surprised at how bizarre it potentially could be. And if you look at it from a perspective of this is just one perspective of a myriad of possibilities and perspectives that you find around the globe of how to interact with land, is this idea of private ownership and this little parcel of land. And that is only one potential possibility, but it's become so normalized and unquestioned. And I'm excited that hopefully this can in some way start to think about other possibilities, and we can start to really tease those out and make that discussion live within this country in the UK as well as further afield. So I'm really excited to hear about how these kind of questions play out across the world.
Great, thanks, Col. And I think, yeah, you set that up perfectly. Because I think for me, I've been somewhat on the journey with you, and I do agree that I've come to start to realize that actually the family farm is quite a bizarre setup in many, many ways. Whereas just, a year ago, I would have thought that that's in my mind, it was just the way it always was. Like that, I've been literally programmed to think that. And I hadn't questioned that at all. So it has been it's just a shock. It's always a shock when you realize your worldview is very limited. And so I think that's something, Erin, you already said a little bit about this in terms of that. I know you have your workshops illuminating worldviews, and that's part of what you're doing at River. And I'd love to hear your take on owning land, and just from the perspective of Aotearoa, how does that relate to your relationship with land? Or
Cool. Kia ora. Oh, so cool to hear everybody's stories, just to kick us off, and thank you for all of that. One thing I noticed as well, just in everybody's speaking, is how interconnected identity and land just is. Like, and every single person just touched on that in a bit, and I think that's a really important thing to know as you guys venture through all these conversations. Is when we talk about land, we are talking a lot about ourselves, and our land is not this commodity, it's not this property, and that's part of the problem, is that that worldview of land as an object, as if she's inanimate, and therefore disconnected from us as humans, and we're somehow disconnected and superior, and this hierarchy of relationship of ownership over land as a commodity or a property, this ability to sell land, to extract from land, like any other household item, is kind of part of the problem that we need to identify and discuss. And also just that, that identity connection. Josina, I really appreciated you mentioning within the self of colonized and colonizer, and that reckoning, that internal reckoning individually and then as a community, is so intertangled. So I really appreciate, just to start off, the ability to identify that and open that as part of the conversation, because I think sometimes when we have these conversations, people get defensive and it blocks everything, because all of a sudden you're defending yourself, your sense of self, your identity, or your ownership over land. And it means that you can't then explore or imagine a different kind of reality. So I just want to appreciate that. In terms of the family farm being a colonial concept, yeah, for sure in Aotearoa, you know, that's not a super clear cut black and white phrase for me. The first thing I thought of was the disposition of Indigenous lands, and then being carved up into farms, dairy farms predominantly in Aotearoa. We're just one huge dairy farm currently, and poisoning our waters at the same time, because we dairy with nitrogen, we dairy with all these inputs, and we use pesticides, including glyphosate, to round up all of our weeds, and we do really, really dumb things like that. So there is a movement to regenerative farming, but I think one other thing about this, the family farm thing, is when we carved up, or when, you know, some of our ancestors carved up the land here, they weren't looking at the land as a huge system or a living system. They were looking at it as an object, and as a money-making object, and a tax-producing object. And so when it was carved up, there was no real thought of the function of the wetlands, for example. And so there are now several hundreds, probably thousands of family farms on wetlands that have been filled up to be able to hold cows and dairy. And so these precious wetlands are now gone. 90% of Aotearoa's wetlands plus are now gone, and we have to reckon how to restore that for our country, which is meant to be clean and green. It's not. And so I think about that, the use of land, no matter where it is, carved up and no longer part of this big living system. The disposition of land, and then this concept of ownership of land. And I want to just contrast that with more of a Māori perspective, or what I'm learning is more and more of an Indigenous perspective worldwide, is earth and land as a mother, or as an ancestor. And I don't want that to come across as myths and legends, or as just sort of like a quaint storytelling. I want that to come across as a physical reality, and a biological reality. We are of the land, and one day we will be soil. When we are buried ourselves and decomposing, we will return to the land, and the minerals in our bodies are of the land. And I think once you start to accept that reality, you can start to see that the connection with the land is not just physical, it's also spiritual, and we depend upon the land. Without her, we have no purpose together. And so here in Aotearoa, that's quite a big current discussion, particularly with this concept of legal personhood. And I wanted to put that on the table again, just as one example of a way forward where ownership is sort of shifted slightly. So, and just let me know, Abby, if you need me to like run for, okay, yeah, I'll look to you. So the legal personhood is a really useful tool within a Western legal system that can recognize that the land can own itself. And so here in Te Urewera, the forest, she owns herself through legislation. And she owns herself, which means the human superiority kind of hierarchy where owner over land has been removed. She's now recognized as having her own intrinsic value. And then there's a board of humans appointed to speak on her behalf. And this gets a little more complicated when we add in that those humans are tūhoi humans, because that's our land that we relate to, that is our mother, our iwi whenua, or our place of belonging, our place of return. And we would be uncomfortable with owning the land because of this concept of a child can never own the mother. So it would be arrogant of us actually to assume an ownership position over land, because it was never part of our psyche to carve up land in that way. We have other concepts of mana whenua, of tūranga waiwai concepts that probably won't dive into in this kōrero, in this conversation, but those are other ways of relating to land where instead of having rights of ownership, you have rights of responsibility, or you just have responsibility. And in that, you have this reciprocal relationship where you get to belong to the land, you feel aroha or love with that land, that piece of belonging that's part of you. So it's more than an intellectual exercise, it's part of a real feeling of connection to the whenua and the land and to your family grouping that lives there, your community that lives there with you. So it's a way of being in the world, a way of connecting, a way of being. Yeah, and so the legal personhood then becomes this, I think, really clever legal trick where you can have it recognized within a Western legal system, but what you're actually uplifting is a tūhoe worldview and a tūhoe legal system that is now enforceable within the West. So it's created space within legislation for tūhoe to actually be tūhoe on the land. So yeah, it's pretty powerful in that sense. And so when tūhoe get to make decisions as a board, they speak as the voice of te urewera, and like a company, you know how with companies, your first thing is your profit margin. And so that's the company must act in the best interest of profit. Well, here it's you have to act in the best interest of the forest. And so our big conversation at the moment is where's our starting point as people returning after being colonized for 170 years, which I guess is a short amount of time in the scheme of the world's colonization, but is a long amount of time for any individual whānau or family that's part of here. And so we've got to this point now where where's our starting point? How do we recognize how to relate back to this land when we've all lived in a colonized reality, all us humans that are alive now? And what we recognize is we have to go inward and identify our own internalized habits that are still imposing upon the land. And so we recognize that we're not here to manage a resource. It's not resource management, it's human management for the benefit of the land. If that makes sense, just sort of flip that one. So human management for the benefit of the land in our management plan. And that means that what we start to do is we look at what is, as the human, you know, the land's been here for so long, like for just millennia, she's ancient and enduring. And we have just sort of come along in the last 5 seconds and in our existence have just imposed, right from cutting tracks for our own convenience of access, right through to climate change, which impose floods and washes out her valleys. And so we need to recognize the impact that we're having and manage that for her benefit. It would be also arrogant again for us to try and manage her. It's beyond our human perception what her living systems are and what they require. And so part of that starting point then is not only recognizing our impact and our responsibility, but also rebuilding an intimacy with her, with the forest, with the land, having an intimate relationship so that we can actually be in conversation with her and in reciprocity with her and know how to be responsible, not just assume we know. So I might round it off there because I feel like I went like this a bit, but yeah, it's a really, really big conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you wove all the different things in together. And I do like the legal personhood thing. For me, when I first heard about it in January from yourself at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, it did feel to me like the first time that I'd ever heard of a situation where the Western legal system had worked with an Indigenous legal system, and that the outcome was that the Indigenous legal system was lifted up, or in this case, the Maori or the Tūhoe one. And I just thought like, wow, that is the coolest thing, because that it gave me a lot of hope that there is possibility for finding that the interwovenness somewhere amidst all of this. So I really appreciate, and I know you're involved in that work in an ongoing way. So that's really exciting. And I wanted to, I mean, Severine, obviously, in a way, the Agrarian Trust is doing the work around ownership within the American or the United States legal framework, and what is possible there. And I don't know if you have any reflections on what ownership means from the perspective of the Agrarian Commons, and from your perspective, sorry.
I just want to say thank you to Erin and echo back to you how thank you for what you say, and that we are programmed by the environment that we were raised in, that we are basically domesticated in domesticated ecologies. We are basically creatures of a zoo, of the colonial project, of urbanity, of modernity, of mining, of the digital world. We were marketed to as children to think of ourselves as products. You know, we are all victims and suffering from the assumptions of, you know, global capitalism, and that if the project that we have as, you know, this and probably the next few generations is to repair the function of our ecosystems and the function of our farm systems and our capacity for governing ourselves, that then the work is very clear that we have to reconstitute our capacity, and probably in doing so through the portal of agriculture, which is, you know, the portal of the colonial process. It is the portal into industrialism. It is the portal into settled and into empire. That it makes sense that we would be doing this right back in that same, like you could say, gear shift of the agrarian question. And having spent so much time as a young person in domesticated ecologies, and then as an organizer within the kind of agrarian, very white dominated space of the organic movement in the United States, there was a lot that I took for granted about what it meant to farm and what a family farm is, and what is the right labor relations, and which work should be done by men and which work should be done by women, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in the encounter with the wild, in the aqueous context, in the water, in the sea, in the algae, that I was able to get much more wobbly mentally, such that it could inform some of that landed, what Peter Linebaugh talks about a lot. Or I was thinking, you know, Donna Haraway always says, who are you thinking with? And in this last thing I was writing, Rachel Carson writing At the Edge of the Sea, and Peter Linebaugh, who wrote about pirates in the commons. What's his name of his book? I'll click it for you later. But he talks about that, our capacity to reconstitute the social systems and the social relations that govern our use and experience of land. But in that wobbliness that exists in the sea, because it is the public trust, because it is a self-willed space, because it is gigantic, then in that encounter, in practical, you know, physical feedback loops of intimacy, of touching and being dangerous, that there's all these kind of emergent principles and behaviors that are inherent in an ecological system, that is that spontaneity of adaptation, which is multi-situate, which is polyvalent, which is multifactorial, which has genesis in everything, that all the beings that we cohabit with each have will force that is exerted. And of course, that's the exact opposite of, you know, message at a distant, transmitted email, directive, you know, control X, click Amazon, whatever it is that you're doing inside of the real, you know, the normal world. And so anyway, in that wobbliness and in those emergent principles, I also found a language of metaphor that allows, I think, what will be a multi-year, multi-decade project of getting that capacity back, to be reactive, to be responsive, to sense what is emergent. I just leave you with one little metaphor, which is that when the low tides come, which they just came, they bring the weather. And that's what all the old timers say. And that's what we just had, was 3 thunderstorms and a rainbow yesterday. And when when the seaweed is exposed at low tide and the big seaweed beds are all desiccating in the air, when usually they're underwater, they're emitting iodide particles into the air. And the iodide particles are combining with the electromagnetic, the polar energy, the water vapor, and those chemical particles are interacting with the magnetic particles, with the currents, with the winds, with the magnetism of the earth and the moon, and with the weather systems that are raging up the coast. I mean, talk about complicated, but basically it makes the clouds more bunchy and makes the rain come. And so maybe that's the thing to think about in this work that's challenging, and that is in this time of COVID, is a contraction. You know, it's painful, it hurts. You know, we have to change how we're working, and that contraction is maybe a bit like the suffering of the seaweed who emits a particle and that changes everything around herself. I don't know if that's true, but it could be worth thinking through.
Beautiful. Thanks, Severine. You are the queen of metaphors. I feel like you're always expanding my mind in like amazing ways with metaphors. So yeah, I love that beautiful vision of the exposed or the suffering seaweed creating the rain. And Josina, I wanted to hear from your perspective, you know, what the idea of owning land, what does that kind of, what are your thoughts on that, I guess, and through the lens of Lion as well?
Yeah, it's really an honor to hear from Erin and Severine about so much and bringing in the spiritual ecologies and, you know, really honoring the histories of everywhere. That gives us perspectives on how to do things differently. In the early days of speaking to Col about the podcast, I mentioned someone who I learned from at Soulfire Farm. Noah, one of the teachers, gave a talk that was about the legacy from West and Central Africa prior to colonialism happening, and the models of the kinship-based commons, that no one, like to the Yoruba, you could never own land, you could only steward it for the ancestors and the unborn. And, you know, how did that affect people on plantations and maroonage and people who escaped enslavement? And I would say that, I mean, Lion is still learning so much about how to do things differently, and we're so far away from a kinship-based commons or any kind of village farmer setup where everyone helps each other. And I don't know how much hope to have if we did have, you know, if we got to the point where there's a sizable number of Black farmers in Britain, will they be farming together? And, you know, in creating an organization where there's a land in our names, you know, having a land that has a name attached to it, it was always really important that it's in our names collectively, rather than, you know, Josina wants something, Ola wants something, we're going to have a piece of paper and it's ours. And it's a falsehood. You know, you work under a system, which means that you have to do some sort of transaction and purchase, but it would never be something where there's like a fence and a big barbed wire, you know, bit. And yeah, I mean, what I really want to talk about, and I'm itching to talk about, is that I went to Scotland and that learned so much in the Highlands, and then it just so happened, and I don't know how much Erin and Severine have even seen that this happened, but just on my way back from north Scotland all the way, you know, like doing a little tour of, you know, Scotland's really like actually quite spaced out, but going to Glasgow, which is one of the belly of the beasts of, you know, slavery money and wealth coming back, you know, all of the towns that are sort of near the sea are places where the wealth came back. But it just so happened that I was there for only 24 hours on the same street that there was a huge protest defending two people who Immigration Enforcement Home Office were trying to take away. And that just really highlighted, you know, the nature of resistance, I guess, to what people, you know, what land borders people are trying to enforce now. And there's a really strong anti-raids network up there. And I mean, the community's tiny, everyone knows each other. I met people that I'd met in London and were brothers and sisters of people that I knew. And that's just a nice benefit. But it just, you know, showing that continuation of having done all this work up further up in Scotland to talk about where the money came from and where it was flowing back to. And then you have two people, you know, these are our neighbours was the chant, that were from countries that were colonised, and that, you know, the right to be in the city, you know, let alone a rural space in Scotland, was still having to be fought for. And, you know, that once upon a time there was this idea of, you know, that the sun never setting on the British Empire, it was all one bit, but who still had the right to be in all of it. And then now that's going. And then you see this tension that at the end, when they were finally freed, because the crowd just kept swelling and swelling, and the man that was under the van was like not going, and, you know, yeah, there was, you know, legal support and everything offered. It was just, I mean, such good energy, that then you saw this tension between how Scotland sees itself, you know, the person that said this would never have happened in an independent Scotland, and the Home Office of Britain, and that the order would have come from London, which is, you know, the place where I was returning to ultimately. And it just, yeah, just highlighted so much of that complexity of, you know, what British land is and who can belong to it, and that you can have a community that sees the van, sees, you know, big scary people in uniform trying to take their neighbours away, and they're saying, no, you can't do that, we're not going to let you. And that, what does that mean that we can do across the island? And, you know, can we win? I hope so.
Totally. And yeah, that when you first recounted that story to us, Josina, it was like, I mean, amazing that you were there in that moment, and that energy kind of all coalesced. And it seems, yeah, to just, it really, you know, Col's story of the Highlands, and if you listen to Landed, you'll be taken on a bit of a journey of like what came before Lynch, you know, the farm, and in certain parts of Scotland, it's not actually that long ago that there were different ways of being in relationship to land, and to then bring that, connect that to the British Empire and the like return, or, you know, people coming from different places and not being welcome on the homeland. Yeah, that is very, I don't know, it really highlights just how global all of this is. And yet it's about land that people feel belonging to and connected to. And, you know, Erin, when you were talking about it, you know, in a way, in some ways, it's about reconnecting with the land, and then, yeah, I just think that's a really interesting jumping off point in a way, because one of the things that comes up in the series is the Gaels, who are the indigenous people of the Highlands, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point here, Col, but there's not really a movement to, or the movement isn't about returning the land to the Gaels in the Highlands, but it's much more about a questioning of what is that place of belonging. How do we define that today in Scotland, in the Highlands? Because Erin, you used that phrase, our place of belonging. And I'm just using that again, because I think it is so much more complicated. Well, particularly in the UK, where we have people from all over, people who the British actually displaced ourselves. And then, it's multi-layered. So what does a place of belonging look like? And how do we define that in the 21st century? Like, how can we move forward to welcome people to land and to engage with a place of belonging? And I realize no one has the answers to that, but just speak from your own experiences, and that's beautiful. That's wonderful.
I feel like that's coming to my direction. Yeah. Oh man, that's so the question for our times. Where do I belong? And I was literally just cruising around with a cousin of mine yesterday, having the same conversation. And I just want to acknowledge how important, and it makes me think of our mental health and our spiritual health and our social health, and how we see ourselves in the world, and what we're able to even achieve as people and as families, when we don't have that sense of belonging, and when we are floating around in the world trying to find a place to grab onto. And I mean, really hurtful when, as a colonized person, when you actually are on the land that did belong to you, but you have no access or no legal right within this Western legal system to actually go and be and connect. And I think, I guess there's lots of things we could sort of talk about in this, but one thing I want to talk about, because I've been working on it recently, is contaminated lands. So we've actually poisoned lands and poisoned waterways so that we can no longer access or use them. And we've done that here in Aotearoa, where sawmills. So we did. Aotearoa, when the English first arrived, it was just a huge forest. You can imagine quite a dark landscape, just thick green forested spaces and big swamps and wetlands, and mountains and rivers and all sorts. And so sawmills and timber industry was huge. We had these huge trees, the kauri trees, kahikatea, these massive trees, some of them very close by. They were just massive, and some of them were turned into matchsticks, literally. Such a painful thing when you consider that if Papatuanuku, or the earth, is as your mother, considered your mother, then all of our trees and the animals, the birds that we have here, are our older siblings. That's how we would translate that into English, as considered our relations. We have this sibling relationship, and they're our older siblings. The human is the youngest, the annoying young one that comes around, just disrupts everyone and everything. But this contaminated land, so we had these sawmills, and they used pentachloral phenol, which is related to Agent Orange. And they would, our men would actually be dunking these timber. It was an anti-sap stain to try and make pine stronger, so we could use it for railway sleepers and things. And then they would take the waste from this and go and dump it in different parts of our rohe, of our area. And poisoning over 40 years, kind of blindly, but actually secretly, knowingly, poisoning not only the people and their families through using sawdust on their gardens and burning some of this wood in their open fires in their homes, and the intergenerational impact of that poison, but also poisoning the land to a point where for hundreds of years, if we do nothing about it, that chemical PCP will be staying in the land and the soil. And if we even had cows grazing on that land, it could be ingested and then be poisoning people. And we actually don't know the impact, again, the complexity of the living systems and it filtering into our water systems over generations. And part of the problem with this and where it's connecting to belonging is now that those lands are contaminated, it's not just an economic thing of, oh, now it's you can't utilize it, now it's, you know, out of bounds. It's actually this spiritual thing, like that land that we're talking about. We have connections, we have stories, we have relation with this whenua, with this land that we can no longer exercise. And then the life forms that are on that, like the eels that we would use, or the oysters, or all these different sediment, we can no longer eat those. And so it's not just about having food and having 3 meals a day or whatever, it's about the relationship and that intimacy and that therefore belonging. Because you can imagine, you know, when you get that feeling of homesickness and you start thinking of small things about your home that really actually are so meaningful to you, it's like that, but with the great landscapes. It's just this yearning of connection and yearning of belonging, and how that impacts us as humans now that we're in this kind of scattered, globalized world. Is I can see it just echoing through our mental health. And I see that as one of the hugest problems is in our own healing, is actually finding a place where we can, where we belong, and feeling settled and feeling okay, you know, permission to be there, no fear that you'll be booted out soon, or, you know, and that's, I suppose, just to link it back to what we were discussing earlier with ownership, one of the biggest problems we're going to have with ownership or moving on from a system of ownership is that security. It's so worldwide now. It's quite, we're going to have to find these tricks about how to own together, or how to share. How basic is that? How to share with each other, how to share space. It's really the only thing we have is space and time. And how do we share peacefully with each other so that we all have security of belonging? No answers, just thoughts. big question, that one. So yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, kia ora.
Yeah, no, that was, yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and I think you answered it perfectly. And I really appreciate, you know, talking about the contaminated lands, and that it's almost, it's like, it's not just a lack of resource, or the resource is gone, but it's like the sickness of you as well. It's a real, I could feel that coming through. And yeah, it's obviously devastating in so many ways. And I wonder, Cole, I realized, sorry, I missed you out in the first round as well. But I wonder, did anyone else want to reflect on this? How do we find a place of belonging? Or how do we define that? Or what does that mean in today? And I guess in particular with respect to land. And land rights, or being on land. Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, Severine? You're on mute.
I wanted to speak to this contamination point. Because it's not permanent. I mean, Rebecca Solnit says all the time about hope, that hope is not knowing, and not knowing that it could actually work, or that what we're doing might make a difference. And you know, that's another nice wobbly one. But we made a film once called "The Solution to Pollution is Life," about bioremediation in an urban ag context with contaminated soils from 19th century smelting, and how, in fact, when you add microbial life to these places that have been so impacted by contamination, that the poisons become immobilized by these threads of life, the mycelium and the enzymatic action of these tiny creatures under the soil. And with our like, again, here I am in algae world, and algae world is being mined at the moment. Our wild algae forests that sustain this extraordinarily productive marine ecosystem, up all the way to right whales and puffins and guillemots and porpoises, and I mean, oh my God, and the fattest clams you ever saw, all being generated by the sunshine coming through the algae and macroalgae in the bottom of the trophic web, and then feeding up everything else, converting light into energy, into bodies, into carbon. And that seaweed is being mined to pump down into the holes in the earth near hydrocarbon exploration sites by environmental engineers who are trying to, remediate. And so, I mean, obviously the configuration of Belgian, contractors with orange hats being deployed kind of in an Ernst & Young mercenary way to these sites of extraction is problematic for other, social reasons. But, that from a material science perspective, what they're taking is a wild ecosystem and they're converting it into an adjudicant, to basically incite life. They want to incite life because life stops the poison migrating. And of course, then as a practical farmer person, I say, well, get your fertility closer to the source of use, people. And we have plenty of degraded rivers that could be the sites of growing algae that's a remediator and a cleaner upper in the river itself, and then come up from that onto the herbicided, drill sites, and plant shade trees right up above that help mitigate runoff from urban. So that that restoration and reparation are super linked also in the way that our logic can start to grasp onto the logic of the ecosystem, like right there, right tightly in the headwater runoff relationship as well. And that's the other big part of deconstructing our kind of global supply chain, Zimzam world is, okay, I'm here. What is the solution that works here? How do I bring shade to this place that is herbicide compacted? Okay, where do I bring the where does the sponginess come from? Moving on. Shut up, Severine. Sorry, I talked too long.
It's brilliant. Yes, Erin, go for it.
Just wanted to respond to Severine. Thank you. And it's so true. Like all of these things it's hard to talk about all this stuff because it's so interwoven. And I really, really appreciate you bringing the sponginess and the wobbliness into the conversation, and acknowledging bioremediation. I'm definitely going to look out for the movie you mentioned, the film. And just to finish that, the contaminated lands that we are working on here is we are trying to find bioremediation, so using fungi and poplar trees, so myco and phytoremediation. And Ngāti Awa, which is one of our iwi, led this project with this belief that usually for remediating contaminated sites, you would go and dig it up, drive it somewhere else and dump it. So now that land is now a waste product, which is just, too hard basket. But for Ngāti Awa, for our tribe, that was just completely illegal in our view. That's just so wrong that you would first of all treat land in that way, and second of all take something from our area and dump it in somebody else's area as if that was the solution. And so invested a lot of time and energy and volunteer and love into remediating land, and the concept of whakapapa, which is that everything is interconnected. So fungi are also our ancestors, we're all connected. And to really dig deep on that thought within a Western mindset, we need to really start to introduce that and see that. And I think that once they figured that actually putting this white rot fungi in the earth and then growing poplar trees, the fungi could break down the chemical PCP and the poplar trees could start sucking it up. And they had a result of 85% remediation, which is just unreal for PCP and the dioxins that's left behind. And so that was something that was created in a trial led by Ngāti Awa and supported by Western science, which was so freaking cool because of that curiosity about each other and recognizing that's not just the remediation that's important here. It's again, that connection back to the land, the education, the uplifting of the interrelationship, the kinship between land and person. And one frustrating thing, just to kind of set us back to reality. So that trial happened. It was really, really cool because of how we related to each other and how we brought in each other's worldviews and came to these findings. But then when they did the big remediation of one of the canals, they just stuck to the science and they pushed Ngāti Awa out of the way. And they had one person who was actually a scientist, a Ngāti Awa scientist, really coming up with these theories. And they got her to be a cultural monitor. So her job was to watch the sieve and see if any more bones came through instead of actually being part of it. And so it was like this thing of, oh, cool, tick those boxes, great, love the science, useful, going to do that here, but didn't think wider about the connection. And so the environmental outcomes become lesser and less impactful and less intergenerational because the worldview of seeing papa as alive and connected was removed. So even though the science still works, sure, but it's shallower. So I just wanted to round off that story and say thanks, Severine and Josina and everybody for this wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah, it is wide-ranging, and I think maybe Col, maybe you want to reflect on that because I think certainly the series is wide-ranging.
It's exactly that. I mean, a lot of the things that I'm hearing everyone talking about is they're issues that they're universal in the sense that they happen everywhere. Will have their own expressions of a lot of these things, if you try to just focus in on one aspect of it, as you say, Erin, it's pretty shallow if you just focus in on the technical side of whatever it is, without seeing maybe like what is the worldview of that has accrued in a place over time, over a long period of time through interaction and observation and just like generations upon generations knowing a place and understanding how it functions. And I feel that, like, in terms of that question of like but belonging, what does that mean? Belonging doesn't happen from like the top down, you have to it happens from the bottom up, and understanding a place and how do you incite life into a place, the people, the place, the land, the things in the land, the sea, just this understanding. And the topics can be all these topics, they're so broad ranging, but they're so integral that you can't just take one piece out without the whole thing falling apart. And that is something that I think certainly within the world of agroecology or regenerative agriculture, I think we've got a lot to learn about that, and a lot of learning and sort of digging deep because the technical side of stuff is really easy to focus in on, but that's only going to get us so far, I think.
Definitely. And I wonder, Severine, I don't know if you have had much experience of the Little Juba or Jaba community, do you have any comments, I guess, on how is that kind of, obviously the Agrarian Commons has provided a framework, a legal framework for that to exist as a community within Maine. But is there kind of a web that's much wider than that legal framework and the connection to land there, or have you much experience of that?
Yeah, and I think that one is still, now this is the first season on the land in a time of COVID, so I don't want to project too much all at once onto them, because they've also gotten a lot of press, and it's performance art can sometimes be a bit overwhelming. But the if I think about Bread and Butter Farm or Brookford Farm or others of the Agrarian Commons, where you recognize that there are kind of preconditions, and then there are precursor activities, and then there are emergent principles, like you're saying from the bottom up, Col, that it's like an iterative process. That first you're able to get like the weedy species, and then you can get some elders and thistles, and then it builds a succession and a successional dynamic. And it's hard to say, first we did this, and then this occurs, and then there's this next stage, and then it's all very clinical, and you'll know exactly how it will conclude, and QED. Obviously, because like in the case of Bread and Butter Farm, they started as a team. They took over a farm that was 100 cow dairy that was just cows and hay, and it became a raw milk dairy, a hay operation, multiple greenhouses, a summer camp for kids, pizza night on Fridays, and and creamery, like butter. And so then you have all this dynamism that starts to grow, and all these relationships of the people who come for the butter and stay for the summer camp, and who become allies and advocates, and who become also themselves transformed by what they experience directly as possible, right? I think that's something to remember, that by participating in increasingly functional systems, we grow our own confidence in a commons. That we have, that confidence is also a precondition of being able to take the risk to make it happen. And again, back to our earlier very beginning of how programmed we all are by this injured world, and as creatures living in a zoo of commodity fetishism, that trusting ourselves to be freer, trusting that it might work. I think that's hard. I think a lot of us believe more in the end of the world than in the end of capitalism. And obviously that would be something we would have to change first.
Wow, I love the zoo of commodity fetishism. That's quite a phrase to frame the world, or the capitalist worldview. Thanks for that, Severine. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'm interested in, I think that Landed doesn't say, is not professing that we're going to meet the end of capitalism necessarily, but what it is, for me, what the journey is like unpicking and realizing that there are other ways than the way we've been programmed. And as you've been saying, it's like, this is just one viewpoint that we've been, and this land ownership model that we're all in agreement about, not all, but many are in agreement about, particularly in the UK, this is true, that it's sort of a trap. And we don't need to be trapped by it any longer. And to come out of that trap is incredibly daunting. And as you say, maybe it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine what it looks like to come out of that trap of this ownership structure. And so we do have a few questions, but I just wanted to, at this point, we've heard about the legal personhood as a structure, and the Agrarian Commons, or Agrarian Trust, as a structure, and also the Yoruba kinship-based commons as an alternative way of relating to the land. Sorry, I hope I pronounced that right, Josina. And then also Col, in the series, it's talked about the clans and the Gael's way of relating to land. And I'd love you guys to comment or to share a little bit about what is your vision for beyond this trap that we all live in. Like, if you were to just say in, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes, just a little snippet of this world that we're kind of bringing into being through all this mess and complexity, like what does it look like to you? Could you describe that? Do you have any visions, or do you have any sense of what it is? Like, what is that sensory feeling of getting through this? Does anyone have any? No pressure. I realize it's a difficult question, but I'd love to see if anyone has any sense of what's possible here. Go, Col.
I'll start. It's something that we talk a little bit about in the series. The Gaels, in the language of the Gaels, which is Gaelic, they have this concept which doesn't have a translation called duchas, and it's actually gaining quite a lot of interest in recent years for quite maybe obvious reasons, but it was basically like the governing principle for how the Gaels would understand their world and their place in it, and it's a sort of sense of belonging to the place, but the land also belonging to you, but you belong to that, and your culture is part of this. Your everything is part of this, and there's no real separation between you and the place you are, and it's all sort of one. And this was like when it was invoked, this idea was invoked when people were being removed. It's like this is breaking this our law of duchas. But it's really interesting that this is being picked up now in our place, and this it's a kind of cosmological thing, in the sense that we're trying to try to understand what that would mean now. How can we relearn ideas like that? And it's I think trying to find these ideas that really challenge our very narrow possibilities within our if you like, cosmological worldview of the Western modern societies. How can we find those key concepts and work out how they connect with other places? But yeah, that's something that I think is really quite critical, is just finding these possibilities within worldviews.
Cool. I'll jump in after that. Land back is a vision. And when we think about these worldviews and these concepts and these worldviews, acknowledging that is associated within a history of disposition and disconnection. And so decolonization is a vision. And the coin flip of that, of reconnection to land, is the vision. And we can't really adopt concepts from Indigenous peoples without also talking about sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. We can't continue with this imbalance of power and oppression of Indigenous peoples in their own lands, and enjoy the benefits that disposition has afforded other peoples. And it's me talking as a person who is descended from both, and how complex I recognize that reality, and I recognize the emotional side of that, the defensive side of that. I understand. But I think that if we step back from all of it, we have to reckon with our history. And we have to find justice in order to really, really combat this capitalist society. The other kind of visions that I like to share and encourage people, and listening to Severine as well, is and to Josina, about your point about this protest and those people belonging. Those stories are really important. I just want to acknowledge the term emergent strategy as well, as a way of starting with the self and the community and building that connection between people, the sharing of ideas and the sharing of space. So really appreciated, Severine, your story about this farm that's kind of transitioning into a place of freedom and of actually embracing everybody and finding roles within that space for people to play out and for people to be in and to belong to, because it's when you contribute and you reciprocate that you actually build that sense of belonging. And that doesn't come from a policy dude in a suit with a tie writing something out clever on his Microsoft Word, and emailing it to everyone. It comes from the practice of actually being on the land and being with each other and going through conflict, interpersonal conflict, and figuring out how to remedy that and figuring out how to be honest again, having integrity within our relationships. And that's what that is about decolonization, is having integrity within the relationships, not just kind of dusting about because it's inconvenient to consider what power sharing might look like. And it comes to trust and honesty. How basic again, eh? It's so basic, but so basic because it's complex, if that makes sense. Those are kind of the hardest things for us to practice as humans, and probably the most addictive things within our capitalist society, that we get to hide behind individualism and hide behind the comfort of your own walls. And you don't really have the same sort of accountability that we had when we lived in community. So that accountability and integrity, trust and power sharing is kind of the vision of what's next. Yeah Cool.
Well, and that we have to live it, that we it's easy to adopt an emoji or an identity that's or rights frameworks or kind of superficial ideas of what should be right or what should be correct or what's correct or who I am. Not to roll my eyes, but it gets a little millennial sometimes, and I want to say, like, show up and it won't be simple, because we are all these creatures, we are all these injured creatures, and we will trigger each other and we will bully each other and we will have to work through conflict. And if we make the buckets and the structures to sense and to address these things openly, it's going to take us a while to reconstitute our capacity to govern ourselves in relation with other. Before, this is I think it's a 100-year project. So as ideally doing it while farming, I would say, because then you're accountable to life in a way that I think it gets a bit fragile in the city, when it's just all ideas versus ideas. When you're trying to make sure that the animals have water and that the plants have water, and that, there is something about that removes, I'd say, at least 20% of the bullshit. Anyway, I want to go outside also.
We're almost there. A few minutes left. I don't know, Josina, if you have anything to add at this point?
Well, so much has already been said. Like when Erin was speaking, I was like, tick, 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 tick. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. But the repair element of the reparations that we talked about in the podcast are just being so central to any idea of changing landscapes. And if we're going to keep doing things in the same way, particularly farming in the same way, the recent bit of research that Lion did about food growers that are Black and people of colour in London shows burnout and struggle culture and not being taken seriously and having the police called on them for being in their fields. And there's in entering this arena, we're still having the same problems, and any new visions of what we do has to start with repairing what the damage that's been done. and it's hard when there's a lot of people denying that, the harm's being, enacted, or, that the false equivalences that came up in sort of the not England parts of Britain and the UK. There's a book that we talked about, me and Col, it Wisnius, how Glaswegians reckon with the wealth of enslavement that came that way, even if the wealth isn't evenly distributed. I'd say it's one of the most deprived cities or parts of it. Repairing the harm and providing paths to reparations that are holistic, and that can be grounded in the land. And the land does give so much anyway. It can be such a space of retreat and rest and comfort. But finding a way to escape what's the models that are being given to us.
Totally. And I definitely, in the series, you do explore repair and reparation, particularly in episode 3. And I think is really helpful, because it's a term that I think many people find, well, one, don't understand fully, and people react to it badly. And I think when you explore it in the series, it actually really, for me, it gave it such a richness to be embracing reparations, and repairing, and the healing aspect to it is just something that I think is often completely overlooked. So I think that's really important to share. And we are at the last few minutes of this conversation, and I think it could go on for hours because it's many dimensions. But Severine wants to get back outside, and I'm sure Erin wants to start her day on the other side of the globe, and it's late here. So I'm just going to say that the book that Severine was talking about apparently is The Many-Headed Hydra by Peter Langbach. Severine, if you were able to share a link to the film, then we can send that to participants after the remediate, that film. And then there are some great questions, and maybe I'll just leave with the questions, which are that, Erin, people were super excited to hear more about, God, I'm so sorry, I need to get lessons in Maori, but Turanga Wewe and Mana Whenua. Thanks, Olivia. Olivia's been providing phonetic pronunciation, so thank you, Olivia. And then also, people are really keen to hear more about the groundwork that went into the new legal approaches. Both Severine and Erin, how do you convince the powers that be to start on this work, and where does it all come from? And so I think there's huge appetite to learn more, basically. And so maybe we can do some recordings for Farmerama and then answer some of these questions on there, and it can go out in future episodes, so that we can all kind of co-learn on this. So I guess I wanted to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to Olivia, who kind of brought together this launch event this evening, and really did the weaving of the web from around the world. So that's been really exciting. And thank you to all of you for such wonderful contributions. And I think everyone will go away feeling enriched, nourished, and with a lot of questions and a lot of work to be done. And I also encourage everyone to listen to the series. And we really hope it is the beginning, it's the beginnings, or it's jumping off of this conversation and seeing what's possible, so that we can all live into the collective vision that you all beautifully shared. So thank you all. Thanks everyone who turned up to listen. And have a good evening, day, everything. Thank you. Okay. I'm not sure how to end the streaming, but I hope Olivia will help us with that. And
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Abby.